might be a good time to mention that there's really only 3 ways to lose weight. I've said there's many paths to the same destination, but they all fit in one of 3 categories. Dr. Peter T has talked about this, the CR, TR, and DR.
So off the top, if somebody wanted to start losing stubborn fat in 1 week, fat that they've struggled with maybe for decades, what steps should they take to actually do so?
I think first and foremost, when we work with a client, we want to set realistic expectations, because that's the last fat that's going to come off the body. Fat's not stored evenly throughout the body. People have different genetic predispositions. That's why some people have saddlebags, other people have obliques, or carry belly fat, or people carry fat differently. Women tend to hips and butts, men tend to central adiposity, visceral fat. But it is taken evenly off the body. There's no way to really spot reduce. There's some minor research regarding maybe a HIIT loaded spot area followed with some steady state cardio, all combined with a calorie deficit, that might show a minor improvement in one location, but I don't think it's meaningful enough to focus on. So setting the expectation is important. I do a lot of that up front with my clients, because they want to lose sometimes a significant amount of weight, and you got to look at their history. Have they been a roller coaster dieter? That kind of thing. And the quick spot reduction is usually associated with probably too severe of a calorie restriction, which might then result in muscle tissue loss.
Yikes.
So they definitely would want to be doing some resistance training. That I would recommend that for anyone that's trying to lose weight or gain weight. This doesn't matter to me. I just think everybody in the world should be resistance training as much as we know about it now and how beneficial it is. You can lose, at least initially, at a faster rate. And as long as you're getting sufficient protein and doing some resistance training, you can lose more than the recommended 1% a week that you kind of typically hear from a solid dietitian, registered dietitian, and probably not compromise a significant amount of muscle tissue. The longer you do that, the more likely it is that muscle tissue will start to be compromised as with the extreme or quick weight loss. You see, I'm trying to avoid the question because it's not anything I'd ever recommend. Quick weight loss. Certainly, there's somebody wants to do something very shortly. They could manipulate water. We see that with keto diets quite commonly. When you lose the glycogen, you also lose the water associated with the glycogen, so the scale weight drops quickly. But that's not a long-term plan.
Yeah, and it's also like the loss of water weight is so what, really? I mean, it's like...
Right, and it may even put you in what I think we used to call it the Keto Flu, that general fatigue that's associated with the water and electrolyte loss. So you find some people will get tired because they've lost a decent amount of water and electrolytes. And that's one of the things we manage with keto dieters. And I'm cautious to say I've got dieters under my supervision that utilize a whole host of different paths to this same destination. They're all kind of equally successful, or lack thereof, to be honest with you. So I'm usually deferring to the client. What's the best diet? The one you'll follow, and to find out how they would typically like to eat, how many meals a day, what kind of macronutrient blend. Although I would encourage a higher protein content, I certainly wouldn't dictate that high carb, low carb, high fat, low fat diet was required for weight loss. We see equivalent outcomes with those people. So
whether somebody chooses to adhere to a high carb, low fat diet or a low carb, high fat diet, outcomes seem to be the same.
It's personal preference. The same thing would be true with, say, intermittent fasting, whether you skip breakfast or not. I mean, we know from the research, from a lot of the studies on people who've lost the most weight and kept it off the longest, about 80% of them do eat breakfast. And this isn't a knock on intermittent fasting by any stretch of the imagination. It is a method that may allow people to adhere to a diet longer because they're satiated. I think the term Lane Norton uses is the one that feels the least restrictive to you is kind of where I head. So I'm asking a lot of questions when I start with a client. I have my own bias as to what I think the optimal macronutrient blend should be and why, and which particular foods I would select because they would lean towards better satiety. I think we'd all agree that more whole foods, less ultra-processed foods would get us closer to that goal. But aside from that, maybe they travel a lot, or they don't have an opportunity. They do have to eat out, and they don't have an opportunity to cook all their food all the time. And so there's some restrictions based on people's lifestyle, accessibility, et cetera, their work shift. You get nurses and doctors and police, fire, and ambulance who work these long hours that might not have as much access as we do, and convenience. So there's so many factors involved in that. But interestingly enough, as I'm kind of rocking my brain here about the quickest weight loss, sometimes it's necessary to have, I don't want to call it an extreme, but an acute intervention. Somebody, say, with type 2 diabetes. Somebody presents with really bad blood sugars, and you want to get them to lose as much weight as possible because that's the most effective way to lower blood sugar insulin resistance the quickest, is with weight loss. And what we've seen in the research is that actually a liquid diet does that, kind of a low calorie kind of a liquid diet, maybe just some protein stuff, but you can see some pretty extreme reversals. And again, this would be an acute intervention for a particular individual who may have metabolic syndrome, high blood pressure, high blood sugars, and you're like, hey, we got to get that weight off quick. And that would be probably associated with prescription medication for blood pressure control and for blood sugars. Unfortunately, some people are in that position. 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. I think more than 50-60% have pre or full-blown type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
So there might be a cause for initial intervention to get a significant amount of weight loss. That wouldn't be something I think would be long-term, that would be something somebody could adhere to. But within a week or two, you could see a significant decrease. And the number one thing you can do for insulin resistance in particular is weight loss, and a significant enough weight loss. 7% can reverse 95% of fatty liver disease, 5 to 7%. 15% weight loss. A 300-pound person losing 45 pounds can restore type 2 insulin-dependent diabetes by restoring beta cell function for the pancreas. And so there are opportunities that for people to have a significant improvement in their health simply from weight loss itself. And I said that on Tom Bilyeu's podcast about a year ago. I said even the McDonald's diet with weight loss would result in improvements of all the biomarkers. It doesn't seem to matter how you lose the weight. It seems to matter that you do lose the weight, irrespective of diet. Now, of course, I followed that up by saying I would never recommend the McDonald's diet. That got clipped out when the short video was posted on the internet, and people just went apeshit. And I see now there was another McDonald's diet success story recently that Lane Norton's been posting about the last couple of days. Same thing we see in the research. 95% of health benefits are the result of weight loss itself, irrespective of diet.
Wow.
Yeah, that's not a prescription for long-term maintenance. It's not those people said they were very hungry because they didn't eat a lot of whole foods, and they didn't eat a lot of high satiety foods, a lot of protein, a lot of fiber. They didn't do that. But they adhered to an 1,850 calorie diet, which was a deficit for them, and they walked daily, and they lost 30, 40 pounds, and everything improved. Cholesterol improved, blood pressure improved, blood sugars improved, and with fat loss, we know the cancer risk goes down. So a lot of things that people do, at least initially, I think Thomas DeLauer even has evolved to that same opinion when he was devoutly keto when he lost his 80 plus pounds initially. He says now that was probably an important initial intervention for him. It was something that gave him satiety he could adhere to. He lost the weight, but now he incorporates carbohydrates and doesn't fast as often because he's focused on his performance in the gym, which we've seen with Dr. Peter Attia, who was keto intermittent fasting for years, pissed on keto sticks and showed the results on Instagram to us all. And then as he evolved and started focusing on strength, which you see he's now fully vested into strength as his kind of primary goal, carbohydrates and glycogen became an important consideration for anaerobic performance, because that bout of training becomes one of the most important stimulus for muscle growth. And he had seen, especially with, I think, the intermittent fasting, especially the long intermittent fasting sessions that he would do 3 to 5 days at a time, he saw a loss of lean body mass. His DEXA scans year over year showed a significant loss. Paul Saladino was on his podcast years ago. He was devoutly carnivore, keto, intermittent fast. And when strength and performance became important for him, he started introducing fruits and honey, and I think even some yogurt for calcium. That was a question I asked him 5 years ago. So where are you getting your calcium from? It's a pretty important micronutrient to obtain, And he said you could get it from bone marrow. And I'm saying, well, no, where are you getting 1,000 milligrams? Yes, you can get it from bone marrow, but nobody's doing that.
Not just calcium, but like magnesium. Where's he getting his magnesium from?
Yeah. So I think there's been a lot of people who have evolved over time. Mike Butzel is a fantastic resource. I think he's a master's in biochemistry. Same thing. He was devoutly keto, intermittent fasting. And when strength became important, he started carb timing around workouts. You and I talked briefly right before we came on about our friend Sean Baker. He's probably the only holdout.
He really is.
I always say that he's an outlier. That guy is a freak, and has been all his life.
In the best possible way.
100%. Yeah, I just don't know anybody who could perform at that level for that long. He's extraordinary. And no carbs, so God bless him. And I have clients that are carnivore. I've often said that I thought red meat was the ultimate elimination diet. We see that a lot of people who suffer from severe autoimmune disorders and allergies to vegetables, some, maybe not all, find that utilizing that as a elimination diet has resulted in the relief of a whole host of symptoms that they were suffering from. Most famously, I think, with who's the I'm trying to remember the psychologist, Dr.
The Petersons.
The Petersons, yes, yeah. They've talked about their experience, and certainly the daughter's experience with all the symptoms that she used to suffer from, the autoimmune disorders resulting in hip surgery and etc. So there are people who, for one reason or another, seem to benefit from eliminating certain foods, and I would never, question their effort or their results. But we see similar kinds of anecdotes from all the camps. We see them from the vegan camps. We see them from the intermittent fasting camps. We see them from the carnivore camps. We see them from just about any type of weight loss intervention that worked for a particular individual. They will credit all of their health improvements to that particular intervention, which, as we just discussed, is probably largely due to weight loss. But it might also be because there's just certain foods that they couldn't tolerate and digest. And we see that even in the Sonnenberg trials out of Stanford, when they introduced fiber, groups of people, they came up into 3 different groups: those who did better, those who didn't change at all, and those who did worse. Their recommendation at the end of that, their conclusion is that the people who did the worst were the people who had the least microbiome diversity to begin with.
Interesting.
Yeah, so probably covered too many topics there and didn't really tackle the how to lose weight real fast.
No, it's all, dude, I'm soaking this up. And I think the carbohydrate topic is such an important one. I personally have never, I think particularly early on, people might have pigeonholed me as being of that keto camp, which I never was part of. I've written about the ketogenic diet in the context of brain health. Yeah. And in that context, it's a very important diet, and we need to continue down that road of research and discovery, particularly in the setting of neurodegeneration. I perhaps, though, have had a bias towards low carb, but I was never a no carb guy. And I saw the value firsthand that carbohydrates can play in performance. Well, there were two settings for me that really brought this to light. One was I took up boxing during the pandemic. Yeah. And I've always been the kind of guy who I enjoy a fasted workout, right? But boxing fasted is very difficult. And I saw that when I would just have even a little bit of carbohydrates before my workout, I'd perform way better. I'd be less likely to bonk. And then secondly, I did a bit of a cutting phase recently. And I saw that as you bring your calories down, those carbohydrates become really important in order to sustain your performance in the gym. Yeah. You know, whether they help you to eke out 1 or 2 or 3 more reps. I mean, those reps are important when it comes to providing that anabolic stimulus.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. That when we're working with bodybuilders who are dieting for shows, that I concentrate on their strength and their performance in the gym, because I know if they're getting significantly weaker, that they'll start losing muscle. I'll even sacrifice volume. I'll go from 6 sets to 2 sets over the course of time as they get leaner and leaner and leaner, just because they don't have the energy to perform 6 at a high level. But I'll keep their intensity and the load high. And that is just enough to tell those muscles, don't go away. I need you for something here. And that's in a very extreme situation, obviously, you know, for the top 1% of people. Generally speaking, the research does show that fed training versus fasted training, the fed trainers have a greater performance, more sets, more reps, just more volume load. And that's going to be significant over time. If you're just exercising, that's great. Nothing wrong with exercising. But if you're training and you want to have something that's measurable and progressible over time to add mass or strength, if those are your goals, which I'd argue they should be for everyone at all ages, then I think that you should be prepared for that stimulus. I've often said that the neat thing about bodybuilding and powerlifting is it's immediate feedback. You go into the gym and you have a substandard performance. You remembered what you did 3 days ago or 4 days ago. You know something happened probably in the last 48 to 72 hours that resulted in that decline in performance. Either you missed a few hours of sleep, or you missed a meal, or your hydration status was poor, you had some significant stress, and you got into their gym and you just had a bad day. And so you can rectify that very shortly, because usually you can find out what the cause is and then remedy that.
So for somebody attempting to, actually, before I get to the specifics, how does one determine whether or not they should begin with a bulking phase or a cutting phase, or is that even moot if you're a beginner with training?
Kind of. For a beginner, for somebody who has a significant amount of body fat, who's a beginner, hasn't been training for very long, they can realize some body recomposition that a leaner, more advanced training person might have a hard time with in a calorie deficit. So I just want to get them in there. I mean, the most important thing to do first and right out of the gate, I've always said the best exercise is the one you'll do, is to try and find something that can load the muscles that they also enjoy, that they'll continue to do. Because you can prescribe whatever kind of program you want, and if they're not going to consistently do it, if it's not enjoyable, this is one of the first things I do with a client is I'll take them through and how'd you like that? I'll watch their face, and if they're just not enjoying the process, then I need to be cognizant of that and try and design. That's why at my gym I put in a standing bench press, and I put in a Viking press for shoulders instead of doing an overhead barbell. Not everybody enjoys the barbell movements, and especially for beginners, you want to get them on the machines because there's a less of a skill component involved with it, and I can progress them quicker. My goal is to entice people to continue to train by showing them results, and a very measurable result is strength. It's one of my favorite exercises, the high handle trap bar for a beginner, because it's really easy to learn. Anybody can do it, and it's also very easy to add weight to very quickly. We recognize in the industry that that's initially at least neural adaptation. Their nervous system learns, they're just getting more skillful at performing that movement.
Yeah.
And their body learns to recruit the muscles and execute the movement in such a way that it's easier for them, so we can add weight quickly. But over the course of just a few weeks, 3, 4, 5 weeks, they'll see such a significant increase in the load that they're moving that becomes addicting. It's almost like the CrossFit women entering powerlifting meets many, many years ago, when they started enjoying the feel of a heavy single rep deadlift, as opposed to going out there and gutting themselves on all these high endurance exercises, which aren't nearly as enjoyable. That's what I always said, powerlifting was a little easier, I felt, than bodybuilding, is because there's not much deep water involved. There's lots of rest time, lots of sitting. a single rep or 3 reps, and but it's enjoyable, rewarding in the fact that you can lift more weight, and then immediately as soon as you set it down, the first thought is, I could do more. That never ends. For well over 30 years, I'm 55. I can't lift what I lifted when I was 45, but I'm still in the gym trying to set what I call AARP PRs.
AARP PRs. I love that.
That's my current claim to fame. I might even start Larry Wheels has a clothing line. I think it's PR clothing line. I think I'll have to start the AARP PR clothing line for people of my geriatric condition.
I can't believe you're 55, bro. I mean, God, I would never have guessed. So when you're setting up for somebody a diet plan, like how do you go about a calorie target for somebody? Do you just like get online, use one of those calculators, or?
There's only really a couple of ways to do it. You can use a calculator. We use the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation. And you can go online, put in your height and weight and activity level, and they'll spit out a number, and understand that's an estimate. There's a lot of inter-individual variability as to whether or not how accurate that's going to be. Or you can track all the food that you've eaten over the course of at least 3 days, probably a week, along with your weight. And if you're at weight maintenance and you're tracking your calories, at least it gives you kind of a starting point. And then you can use that number and try and adhere to it. At least initially, it helps to start to learn kind of how many calories are in foods by weighing and measuring them, and just seeing. Something like a tablespoon of oil can make a pretty big difference twice a day over the course of a week, and people don't appreciate that. The little flavor dips that you put your chicken in, those things can have 300 calories.
Yeah.
One of those little things. So it's good to start, maybe get a calorie counter. There's a whole number of them out there, and just so you can get familiar with, what has a lot of calories in it.
I've been saying that a digital food scale is one of the greatest so-called biohacking tools anybody can have in their kitchens.
Yeah. And that's a neat way, because then if you measure and weigh everything for just a week and you don't lose weight, I'd want you to be a little persistent, look at your step count, and give it more than a week. But you can now make a very easy adjustment. I take an ounce of meat out here, or I take a quarter cup of carbs out there, and that's a pretty easy way to make a quick adjustment. Run that for another week and see if you lost weight or not. Not everybody enjoys counting calories. It's not necessary. Calories count, but you don't necessarily have to count them. Might be a good time to mention that there's really only 3 ways to lose weight. I've said there's many paths to the same destination, but they all fit in one of 3 categories. Dr. Peter T has talked about this, the CR, TR, and DR. He talked about either caloric restriction, and that's what we just discussed. Weighing and measuring everything and tracking your calories using a calorie tracker if you'd like. Time restriction. I'm going to do a 16-8, or I'm going to do a 18-6, whatever it is. That's a way of potentially creating a calorie deficit, because all of these options work the same way. You have to be in a calorie deficit to lose weight. Or dietary restriction. That's where keto comes in, or paleo, or you just start eliminating food groups or particular kinds of foods, and stop eating out, stop eating ultra processed foods, just cook at home with whole foods, take out carbs, that kind of thing. Not my favorite, because I really want ultimately for someone to look at a diet as a lifestyle. Something that's simple, sensible, and sustainable, that becomes just, it's not something you go on and off. Your diet is the food that you eat, and it should consist of the kinds of things that you enjoy, and just understanding, how much of each of those to eat and how it impacts your potential to weight gain or lose weight. Some foods being more satiating than others, obviously, as we discussed. And so I kind of like the calorie restriction method. That's where I go. I try not to be too restrictive, although I do introduce the FODMAP menu for people with IBS, or even athletes trying to gain weight who need to eat a ton of food. I'm trying to give them the kind of foods that are easier to digest. And so that's where I started moving into the FODMAP menu and talking about specific foods, or foods that were easier or harder to digest, as opposed to and we have a satiety index where we measure how long someone stays full based on the types of foods that they eat. We know high protein foods and high fiber foods are very satiating, But at the very top of this index is boiled potatoes, oranges, which fortunately also are very high in potassium, which is where I like to build a foundation.
Yeah, you're big on potassium.
Yeah, initially I like the foundation to have the 4,700 milligrams of potassium, particularly for performance, and there's a host of other benefits for potassium in the diet. So I try and pick those foods first. I know everybody think it's a red meat and rice diet, but
where does that perception come from? It's because I've seen the illustrations on Google Images of the vertical diet.
Yep. And there at the top you see red meat and rice.
Yeah.
But the foundation is what we build first.
I have a quote from you: "Beef is the only true superfood."
Yeah, I believe that. I believe it's the most micronutrient dense, easy to digest. I think you could not just survive but thrive on it. We've seen that with carnivore, even though I understand that the Harvard study was mostly anecdotes from individuals who were still using the diet. And
it was like a self-selected.
It was self-selected. Yeah, they didn't interview people who had stopped using it for any number of reasons. Now, and I don't recommend a carnivore diet. I'm just suggesting that if you're going to eliminate something, that would be the last thing you'd eliminate. I said it's the ultimate elimination diet, and you'd see the least, I think, decline in performance or potential micronutrient deficiencies from including red meat in the diet. I also, from having a long history of training women as early as the 1990s for bodybuilding, figure physique, bikini, wellness, goodness gracious, the classes just keep going and going. And athletes at the University of Oregon, track athletes, distance athletes in particular, and more recently working with high school softball teams and the women on the Olympic wrestling team. Very commonly, we'll see the female triad, which is chronic calorie restriction, amenorrhea, cessation of the menstrual period, osteoporosis. We'll also see anemia, very common, low thyroid, which of course would result in hair loss, etc. And red meat's a fantastic resource. And unfortunately, what's happened, what started what I saw decades ago, is that these guru diets in the bodybuilding industry in particular would be demonizing a whole bunch of what I thought were very valuable micronutrient-dense foods. Don't eat. And anybody who's listening has probably been given this guru diet by their whatever trainer that they hired for their bodybuilding or bikini show, and that's the one that excludes red meat, excludes dairy, excludes fruit. It's probably light or an absent sodium, and probably not much concentration on iodine, which is important for thyroid function. And they take the yolk out of the egg.
Yikes.
So the diet, as you know, you've seen it many times, it's egg whites, broccoli, tilapia, and a scoop of peanut butter. That's the kind of the foundation of the diet. And I think very many people listening today will probably recognize that as something that they've seen in the bikini industry for many years. And I thought as we'd evolved, we'd see less of that, but unfortunately we see more of it. And we see a lot of problems associated with that. When it was isolated to competitive physique, and it only affected a small number of people, it wasn't as big a deal. But what's happened more recently with social media is that the soccer moms see these women in the best shape of their life on stage in these bikinis with their spray tan on, all this other stuff, and then they try and mimic their diets in the absence of all of the things that go on in the industry they're not aware of, the thyroid medication, the clenbuterol, the Anavar. And so these women, the soccer moms who aren't utilizing this cornucopia of pharmaceuticals but are trying to eat those diets, they end up with anemia, hypothyroidism, hair loss, bone mineral density loss, depression, fatigue, all of those things as a result of trying these diets. And I think it's tragic because now it's in your home with your family.
And oftentimes those female competitors are the level of body fat that they've attained to be on that stage. That's not a healthy level of body fat for a female.
You may have seen one of my rants. I said, if you want to be healthy, don't compete. It's a big difference between health and fitness, because we know what health is, or we endeavor to try and promote good health. But fitness is just the ability to perform a particular duty or task, and the fitness level required to be a pro bodybuilder, IFBB pro, or a world's strongest man, or a UFC champion, or even a 14-year-old gymnast in the Olympics, or a 10-year-old badminton player in China blowing out lateral collateral ligaments. We know all of those athletes suffer from much more injuries, and we know athletes in general, or just more active people, tend to have more deficiencies in micronutrients than sedentary people. They just need more nutrition because they're using more. And so, yeah, I'm cautious. I do understand that, things I put my body through all those years, and a lot of what I tried to do, I've had well over 100 blood tests throughout my career, so oftentimes on a monthly basis while I was competing. Just watching the damage. I was well over 300 pounds at one point. Wow. I got to college, I was 140 pounds.
Wow.
And 10 years later, I was 300.
Wow.
I was diagnosed hypogonadal when I was 20 years old with varicocele. And I was put on to HRT at 20 years old. I was 150 pounds at 20 years old or thereabouts. And 8 years later, I was 300 pounds. I might have deviated from the doctor's HRT prescription a little during those years. But I was also eating an enormous amount of food, doing what we call dirty bulking. Throughout my career, and this is conservative, I've gained and lost, bulking up to 300 pounds to be a powerlifter and dieting down to single-digit body fat to compete as an IFBB pro bodybuilder, well over 1,000 pounds.
Yikes, wow.
And I learned a lot of lessons along the way on the proper way to gain weight and the proper way to lose weight without compromising my health. And I did that by making many mistakes many times and then seeing that in my clients. And so a lot of what I recommend today is intended to get maximum performance, but also to mitigate damage. I work with somebody like a Hafthor Bjornsson who was 440 pounds when I met him. First thing I did was a blood test and had him pull 40 pounds off because we had some metabolic syndrome to manage. And we got to get him into a healthy space, and then I got to take him back up because he needs to be 440 to win the world's strongest man. But we want to get there with a healthier body. And same thing with dieting, like Nadia Wyatt, third place in the Miss Olympia. She had traditionally utilized those guru diets and tons of cardio and would end up just exhausted and weak and kind of emaciated. And she loved to lift weights. She loved the off-season better than competition because she had strength and she had muscle mass, and she would lose a lot of it and get tired and fatigued. And so we kept red meat in all the way throughout the diet, the high iron and B vitamins and zinc. She had better energy. We minimized the excessive cardio and just had her train a little more weightlifting, to get a little bit of the energy expenditure side to keep burning calories. We kept an egg yolk in. We kept fruit in. We kept salting her food, all the way up to the day of the show. I have photographs of every meal that she ate, leading all the way up to the day of the Miss Olympia. And she carried more muscle. She was leaner. She was stronger. She didn't rebound with the very common that you get this significant weight rebound and edema and a whole host of other compromised physical things that happen to you when you over diet. We see it very commonly. So, and I'm running all over the place, but my clientele has such a broad group between Gen Pop and athletes, both in the bulking and dieting, that I just think it's important to kind of cover some of these topics for the listener.
So at what point then did quote unquote health become a priority for you with all of your your training and the competitions? Like at what point did that become a priority for you? And then how did that change your approach from a dietary standpoint?
I noticed from the blood tests from very early on back in the mid 90s, as I started to get heavier and heavier, that I would start to experience some metabolic syndrome. Fortunately for me, and this wasn't by design, I competed in both bodybuilding and powerlifting. So I would bulk up and I would see the metabolic syndrome. I would see my blood pressure elevate. I would see my blood sugars elevate, my cholesterol elevate. All that would occur as a result of the weight gain in particular. But then I would compete in a powerlifting meet and I would start bodybuilding and dieting for a bodybuilding show. And the weight loss would rectify the majority of those things.
Interesting.
And I was doing that back and forth. And so I was never in that metabolic syndrome zone for an extended period of time, which is why I ask all of my big athletes to periodize their weight. Find at least once or twice throughout the course of the year at which you're not trying to maintain such a high body weight, because you see a large percentage of them suffer from those problems, high blood pressure, high blood sugars, fatty liver. So I do try and get them to come down. And then, I had the blood tests along the way, and so that told me. I also experienced that when I competed at 275 in powerlifting, I wasn't any stronger at 305. I was a lot more unhealthy. And so I kind of realized after a while that fat doesn't lift anything. And so I was just trying to maximize my lean mass. So I'm a little more cautious about dirty bulks, about the amount of calorie surplus that I'll recommend. And you even said, how do you know when you're starting a diet whether you should be gaining or losing, bulking or dieting?
Yeah.
And that's at that point at which I said, if I'm north of 20%, it's probably a good idea to do a mini cut or, to try and lose a little bit of fat. And when I get a client that asks me that question, I tell them this is going to be a bit of a roller coaster. We're going to try and add as much muscle as possible while we limit the amount of fat gain. But eventually you're going to get to a point in this endeavor to add as much muscle and strength where you're going to be like, my body composition is north of where I'd like it to be. And we're going to do a mini cut. And then the goal there would be to do it patiently and retain your lean body mass while you're losing fat. And so it's this constant oscillation. But hopefully over time, you gain more muscle, lose less muscle, and then you just so that you can create the body composition that you're looking for. And it gets harder and harder as time goes on. You get closer and closer to your genetic predisposition. And I think oftentimes, as mentioned in the outset, that people's expectations really need to be managed because it's really easy to get on Instagram and see just one scroll after the other of these ridiculous physiques, which genetics reigns supreme. A lot of these people are, you wouldn't see them. You go down to your grocery store or what have you throughout your day, you don't see any of these people. You go to Instagram and everyone looks like that. And so you start to think, well, why don't I look like that? And because it's very hard. You have to have the right blend of genetics, hard work, performance-enhancing drugs in most cases. So you have to be, you set the right expectation, I think, from the outset that maybe that's unrealistic. And when you live in bizarro world long enough, that's the powerlifting, bodybuilding world I lived in for 30 years, you think anything's possible. But guys like Jay Cutler, who won the Mr. Olympia, he was that size when he was 18. So you have to be realistic. Some countries, China, Russia, Germany, they recruit these kids from a young age based on their parents. You got a 6'7" dad who was a standout in basketball or track, shot put, discus. You're probably going to be recruited when you're 5 years old to start practicing that sport because genetics reign supreme. And I see it all the time when I work with high school and collegiate kids that sometimes their expectations or their parents' expectations may exceed what the kids' physical capabilities are with respect to what their genetics are. And by the time you get to college in particular, you're recruiting specimens. These kids are just physical freaks. A lot of them are successful in spite of themselves, which I commonly find when I work with great athletes. I'm just like, how does this guy perform at that level? Because you see these gaping holes that most people wouldn't be able to overcome. Just whether it's sleep apnea or whether it's just a horrendous diet, and you realize that they're just another level of freak. And until they get to the pro levels where there's a bunch of freaks together, you don't start to see the differences that some of these, I think they're big things, but smaller things make.
But wouldn't you agree, though, that with patience, discipline, hard work, that most people can look better than their wildest dreams just by sticking to the program?
Yeah, depends on what their wildest dreams are. Again, that's because we've seen too many. I think it's when you look at social media, you start to think that's achievable.
Like everybody has abs. They're just covered by fat. Yes,
absolutely. And seeing them might not be of benefit. That's another. You get your body fat low enough to see abs, you might find that your performance declines significantly. You feel weaker in the gym. You're more fatigued. Your sleep's compromised. Your testosterone's suppressed. Your cortisol's high. That could all happen just from because not everybody has the same predisposition as we mentioned about fat storage. Some people have abs at 15, 18%. They store their fat preferably maybe in their arms and legs more. And others might have to get down to 9 or 8% to see their abdominals. That might be a little extreme, but you probably usually see them when you get to 12 or under. But by then, they might start to feel pretty tired and fatigued and have low T. We see that commonly when we study bodybuilders pre-contest. We see very low testosterone levels and low thyroid levels, and your body's kind of shutting down at that point. Yeah. So it's not the healthiest thing to be 9-8% body fat.
No.
Yeah,
I mean, I agree with that. What would you say is like a healthy range for?
It's individualistic.
Is it?
It's very individualistic. People store fat differently, and so I would say that range would be. I'd like to go as low as 10, but I think for men, 12 to 15% is a pretty good range. You get under 10, you're pretty lean. You might start to see a compromise in performance or energy or hormones.
Yeah, I recently got to, I was about 15, 16, maybe 17% body fat, and I got down to around 9%. And my testosterone has always run pretty high, up around 1100, if not higher. And I'm 41, but my testosterone dropped to high 700s when I got to that level of body fat.
And it would keep going down for every percentage that you lost. And that's, and maybe you feel fine there. Some people tend to start to feel pretty fatigued and tired.
Yeah, I didn't feel I had no subjective sense of low T or anything like that. And it's my understanding that even that level is still great for somebody who's in their 40s.
Yeah, it's symptom driven because I worked with one of the strongest men on the planet. His blood test, and he was lifetime natural, and his blood test was a testosterone of 400. And we see that with Olympic athletes. A lot of that's driven by the fact that they're overtraining at that time. But we commonly can see testosterone in the 400 range with Olympic athletes. So it's really individual as far as symptoms. You can't just treat the number. You gotta do a real good interview with the individual and treat the symptoms in fatigue, ED, loss of muscle mass, increase of body fat. Those kinds of things would be indicative of low T that was adversely affecting your performance.
And you can find all this out on with just like a simple blood test.
Yeah, I really encourage blood tests. I think you can get a lot of information from those. That's how I discover when I've got an athlete that's got metabolic syndrome, is I'm looking at their blood tests. Yeah.
I want to go back a little bit for a moment to red meat, because I'll just lay out my bias. I'm a huge fan of red meat. I eat it all the time. I very much agree with you. I think it is a food worthy of the marketing term superfood, certainly because of its nutrient density, and for the fact also that it's so accessible. You can thank, whatever the industrial food agriculture complex, which is a double-edged sword. It has problems associated with it, environmental problems, but nonetheless, the fact that most people in this country have access to, whether they live in food deserts or not, to red meat, one of the most, again, nutrient-dense foods, I think, around. I think that's no small feat. That's not a trivial data point. And in your book, you write, red meat is it's a nutrient-dense whole food multivitamin. It's been shown to actually have positive health outcomes. But nonetheless, we see on social media, it's still a very contentious topic, right?
Well, some of that's ethical, some of that's environmental, and those are topics that probably beyond the scope of our conversation. But if you're just getting to whether or not it can be part of a healthy diet, and that's really important here. We're talking about the overall dietary pattern. I said I thought red meat was a very valuable part of a diet. I don't exclusively recommend carnivore, but for those conditions we talked about earlier, potentially. I think you should get protein from a variety of sources, because I think there's other micronutrients available in say, whole eggs, choline, biotin in the egg yolk, omega-3s from salmon. Yogurt, I think, is a superfood.
Me too.
I think you can get people on both sides of the fence to agree on that. We see even the vegetarians and the like that are trying to minimize animal food consumptions. Vegans, not so much so. They do have an ethical position not to consume any animal or animal byproducts, and so I understand that's a different argument. But in terms of health, I think you'll even see sensible vegans who would agree that that's a healthy food. And I think responsible vegans would also be concerned about over-restriction, particularly with children, pregnant mothers. You got to be cautious, because you can do a vegan diet wrong. You can do an omnivore diet wrong, as most of us do. Mostly ultra-processed food, the standard American diet, certainly evidence of that. You can do a diet wrong.
That's right.
So now we look at the overall dietary pattern. I like to get proteins from a variety of sources. I like to see some lean red meats. Chicken's certainly fine too. That's a great protein source. I like to see some dairy in there, cheese. But there's a spectrum in red meat of, I hate to use the word healthy or less healthy, but as it pertains to cardiovascular disease, one of the concerns is does saturated fat increase LDL, or more specifically ApoB, which can increase your cardiovascular disease risk? I think we have a pretty solid consensus now in the research that ApoB is a causal factor for cardiovascular disease risk. Now, how much and how significant the risk is for whom is something that's highly variable. Some people are hyperabsorbers of cholesterol, and those people should be cautious. Some people have other metabolic disorders, high triglycerides, blood sugars, high blood pressure. It would compromise the endothelial layer, which would make it more susceptible to whatever level of ApoB they had in their system. But I think Dr. Peter Tia referred to ApoB as necessary but not sufficient. So ApoB is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It is the particle that can penetrate the endothelial lining and create atherosclerotic plaque. Now, you have to have a sufficient amount of it, and that amount, as mentioned, is different based on the host. You've got high blood pressure, high blood sugars, high iron, poor cardiovascular health, you're a hyperabsorber, high triglycerides. That's all going to make you more susceptible. I think a lot of what the pushback has been amongst, say, the low-carb community is that if you're otherwise healthy, if your triglyceride to HDL ratio is 1-to-1, if you have good blood pressure, et cetera, then ApoB doesn't matter. Or if you have the large fluffy LDL particles and not the small LDL particles, that it doesn't matter. In fact, it does. We've stratified the data looking at people with a high triglyceride and people with a lower triglyceride, and we still see, although it's not to the same degree, you will still see, I hate to use the word linear because people assume it's like this. It's asymptotic. You'll still see an elevation in risk based on ApoB's concentration over time. And understanding over time can be 20, 30, 40 years. The average first heart attack is 65 years old. So when people are like, I eat a ton of saturated fat, and they're in their 30s or their 40s, and they're, I feel great. You don't feel soft plaque accumulation. It's not something you feel. It's something that very gradually over the course of many decades, and of course that's different for everybody depending on their exposure level and again how the host's susceptibility. Some people have heart attacks younger than others. A CAC scan, coronary artery calcification. I have a 0 CAC scan. It doesn't mean anything. 50% of all first heart attacks are with people with a 0 CAC scan. And if you're younger, you should have a 0 CAC scan. And it would be of concern if you didn't.
Right.
Have a 0 CAC scan. You can look a little deeper into a coronary angiography with contrast dye and look at soft plaques to see if you're accumulating a lot of soft plaque, because that can be causal for heart disease as well. So there just seems to be a lot of a defense going on because people have experienced such significant improvements in their health by going on a keto diet. You can do a keto diet and still have low LDL. You would just have to A, not be a hyper absorber, and B, be otherwise healthy, but C, have a lower saturated fat intake, meaning don't suck down cubes of butter and bacon, And
that's really it, though, isn't it?
It really is. And we saw that, I think, when people look at like the Finnish trial. They reduced their cardiovascular disease events by 80%. They were huge consumers of butter. And so they did in Finland, they did a public intervention where they said, look, let's cut down on butter intake or substitute it with something else that would not cause an elevation of ApoB or LDL, and they had a dramatic improvement. People talk about the French paradox. Well, the French, 80% of their saturated fat is dairy.
Interesting.
Cheese, yogurt, and milk. Well, dairy's known to not have that same effect of elevating LDL. Can even be cardioprotective for a host of reasons. One is that the milk fat globulin membrane on dairy doesn't seem to raise the saturated fat, doesn't seem to affect LDL, but also because of the calcium and the protein. And those, calcium in particular can help lower blood pressure, and protein obviously helps with the nitric oxide and vasodilation. So all of those things contribute to a healthier host. And it's not really a paradox at that point. As compared to what is what you have to look at. It's not saturated fat in total. I mentioned there's a spectrum upon which dairy lies, from a Greek yogurt to a butter. It's very different in terms of its impact on cardiovascular disease. I'd say the same thing with red meat. I've always recommended you go with, say, a top sirloin, as opposed to maybe a ribeye. And that's, again, dose dependent. How frequently and how much are you eating, and how is that in your overall dietary pattern? I guess the specific number is when you look at the research, it suggests that when you start to get north of 10% saturated fat as a percentage of total calories, you start to see an increase in cardiovascular disease risk. And again, a lot of variability in that based on the health of the host. So oftentimes we'll get people talking about research where they say that they do not see a difference based on saturated fat intake in cardiovascular disease risk. Those folks tend to cherry pick research. Let me back up just a step. The Cochrane collaboration, which you're familiar with, Cochrane.
Yeah.
One of the most highly regarded research organizations in the world. I think
Systematic.
They're in 53 countries.
Yeah.
They do systematic reviews of all the literature. And they're highly regarded. I hate to use the word gold standard, but they are, I think people regard them as being probably one of the most accurate assessments of the current science. Cochrane did a study in 2020 where they looked at all of the research on cardiovascular disease. And what they saw was an S-shaped curve, what we refer to as a sigmoidal curve, whereby once cholesterol starts to get a little bit over 10-12%, you see this huge inflection point and dramatic increase all the way up to, say, 18 to 20% in cardiovascular disease risk. If you look at the bottom portion, remember I talked earlier about an asymptotic increase, what some people do who are cherry-picking data is they'll look at, say, the Japanese, and they're comparing, say, a 4% intake to an 8% intake, both below the 10% number that the AHA would recommend as being generally considered lower cardiovascular disease risk.
Got it. So, for example, like among a Japanese cohort, whether they're high saturated fat consumers or low saturated fat consumers, overall, they're both low saturated fat consumers. They're
both below 10%. So
Interesting.
when you compare 8 to 4, you don't see a lot of a difference. And so that's when people are inclined, if you cherry pick that particular research, to do the same thing at the top end of the spectrum. You get people with 20 to 26% consumption, you don't see a significant difference. And so you're like, oh, see, it doesn't matter. Eating a high saturated or low saturated, but neither of them were low. They were both high. So that's one way that the literature is manipulated. Another way is when they suggest that elderly people have those with higher LDL live longer. But that's reverse causation, because things like cancer and heart disease and other terminal illnesses lower cholesterol. So when you get somebody with cancer who the cancer is driving the LDL down, and that person passes away with a low LDL, and you compare it to the person with a higher LDL who didn't pass away, that's what we call reverse causality. So these are common, I think, errors that are often made by folks who are pretty determined to try and dismiss ApoB as a causal risk factor, and even more so the suggestion that saturated fat can increase ApoB, which we know does. And we see it not just in epidemiology and randomized controlled trials, but more recently in Mendelian randomization trials that you're familiar with. When people have genetic predispositions for low ApoB, they have lower cardiovascular disease risk. And again, when you stratify those people based on different health variables, whether they're high triglycerides or low triglycerides, or whether they're overweight or not overweight, you still see in Mendelian randomization, you still see people with genetic predispositions for low ApoB to have a lower cardiovascular disease risk.
Yeah. I mean, I'm definitely, how should I say this? Yeah, I've never been of the stance. I've never had a very high saturated fat diet, nor have I advocated for one. And I think one of the bits of logic that I've used is that when you take a cow and you feed it a biologically aberrant diet, it has a higher proportion of saturated fat in its fatty acid profile. And game meat is way leaner than an industrially raised, industrially fed cow. So to me, that just off the bat, you don't have to be a data scientist or a statistician to derive from that the conclusion that nature has kind of preset a relative fatty acid profile that we're probably most amenable to, right? Oleic acid, which is monounsaturated fat, is probably the type of fatty acid that we're most, the most abundant fatty acid in our diet typically, followed maybe by polyunsaturated fats from nuts and seeds. And lo and behold, you look at beef. Beef is 50% monounsaturated fat as well, right?
You're right.
So yeah, I've never been of the high saturated fat camp. But with regards to ApoB in that sigmoidal curve, I mean, can't we still attribute some of that to healthy user bias? I mean, somebody who's eating insane levels of saturated fat, I mean, that person is likely going to be on a junk food diet, right?
100%.
And somebody with very low saturated fat intake is likely going to be on probably some kind of vegetarian diet.
And that's why I think that we had a pretty lengthy conversation about there about assessing someone's cardiovascular disease risk is multifactorial.
Yeah.
And there are people who can eat a high saturated fat diet who are very fit. Dr. Sean Baker's one, although he did have some elevated LDL. He had a 0 CAC scan, and I think he's subsequently gotten a CIMT and coronary angiography. But there's an extreme individual who we talked about. He's very genetically gifted. He's very active. He may or may not be someone who's just not a hyperabsorber, or he's got very good clearance. There are people who can clear cholesterol faster than others. And so the cardiovascular disease risk is multifactorial, and that's something that needs to be assessed by looking at, like you said, the healthy user bias. People who tend to eat more red meat tend to weigh more, smoke more, drink more, and also eat the fries and drink the soda.
Yeah.
And exercise less. And that they try and tease that out in the research. I mentioned stratifying risk. They try and tease that out in the research as best they can. It's imperfect, but there's enough compelling data. And I'm not suggesting that people need to, they should be cognizant of their personal potential risk and make the adjustments necessary in their diet. That doesn't mean they have to completely eliminate red meat. I eat red meat every day. Lane Norton does, and he's a PhD nutrition. Dr. Joey Zondel from Lane's group, BioLane, does. I think Lane even had some elevated LDL, 130 that he couldn't get down, and he eats 60 grams of fiber a day. So, there are conditions under which certain individuals might not be able to lower their LDL.
Like FH.
Yes, familial hypercholesterolemia, exactly. Yeah. So all of those things are a factor. Not everybody gets a free pass. Some people have to be a little more strict than others. We see this in obesity. Those folks have a heightened hunger signal. We see that in PCOS. It's one of the problems with PCOS is that they seem to have less satiety. Their leptin signaling. There seems to be a dysfunction there, and they eat more because they're hungrier. And I said many years ago in an obesity rant that I did that not everybody's like you or me.
Yeah.
I don't have to do too much to maintain 10-12% body fat, but other people, they're just hungrier more often.
Yeah. It's so true. How would you refute some in the vegan camp will, they make ApoB their god, and then because that is the sole indicator of human health, according to them, and that you should have the ApoB of a newborn, that there's no excuse that red meat really doesn't have any degree of red meat consumption is suboptimal.
Yeah. Well, I like that, where you're headed with that, and that's risk. We all incur some degree of risk in life. I got on an airplane and flew out here this morning. On the way down, it moved around a little bit. There's some risk associated with that. 40,000 people die every year driving a car. I still drive a car, and there's some things that you can do. You put your seatbelt on, you try and drive the speed limit, you try not to text and drive with your lights off at night the wrong way down the freeway. And there's varying degrees of that. If you're going to eat more red meat, then at very least you should get a blood test and make sure that you're not, susceptible, highly susceptible. But you should maintain a healthy body weight, not have a lot of visceral adiposity, certainly not have things that compromise your endothelial function like blood pressure and high blood sugars and high iron. But there's some level of risk we're all willing to accept. And I would suggest, and I've seen many vegans and vegetarians, who will have a glass of wine here or there. There's no minimum amount of. We used to think that a glass of wine was an occasional glass of wine was actually health promoting because of the Mediterranean diet, et cetera. We thought it was protective of cardiovascular disease, but now we know that anything more than 0 has a linear increase in cancer and cardiovascular disease risk. We know that. It's a poison. But you'll see lots of these people will have their favorite brew or their favorite wine. And Lane Norton, same thing. And sometimes he gets criticized for it, because he'll have a glass of wine or he'll smoke a cigar occasionally. And he's like, it doesn't have to be that serious. And I understand why the vegans do it, because of their ethical position, that they're gonna press hard on that lever and try and fearmonger. And I'm just not a big fan of that.
Same.
And I'm not trying to do that today. I'm just talking, you should recognize that what the causal factors are and that there is a risk associated with it. And you have to determine whether or not you're highly susceptible. And there's a number of tests that you can get done to see that. I eat meat every day. My ApoB or my LDL's 90. It probably could be 80 or 60. And I might have a less exposure to cardiovascular disease risk, but I don't think mine's high anyhow because for all those other things that I control. But
yeah, mine's about 88, my ApoB, last I checked.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think about ApoB, I think it's fair to say that it's causal, but it's causal in the way that blood glucose is causal to type 2 diabetes.
How high is it?
Right. Like what's the range? I would certainly want to hedge my bets if I was running around and it was, at 120, 130, like, of course, like I wouldn't want it to be there.
Yeah.
But,
well, and it's important to note, and I see this stuff on Sean Baker's site all the time, that the number one cause of death for vegans is cardiovascular disease. So I don't mean to say that flippantly. It's just that eventually we're all going to get there. And how much lifespan or health span are you able to change? And how much of your life did you enjoy eating some of the foods that you like along the way?
Yeah. And also, if it's laying... Say you're laying, nobody lives forever, right? And heart disease is currently first position cause of death in the US.
Right.
But what's second? Cancer. So, you knock that out.
Right.
Provided you keep it at a point where it's hypothetically, assuming that it is even laying down this soft plaque, there's going to be an escape velocity where something else will get you first before that heart disease, of that cardiovascular event strikes.
Yeah, eventually we're all going to die of something.
And for most of the people that are listening to this, if you're overweight, like you say in your book, if you're overweight, and as you've said already here, 95% of the health benefits that you'll get will result from losing weight, regardless of diet.
Your LDL will go down.
Yeah.
From weight loss, irrespective of diet. You can eat even a keto diet that's high in saturated fat, at least initially. Yeah, long term might be another consideration if you're so inclined to be accumulating a lot of ApoB. Yeah, but that's something you can test.
It is. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. And we work with a company called Life Force that makes it really easy to test. That's who I use to do my testing.
It's more and more affordable these days. It used to cost me $350 to get online testing through LabCorp, and now it's probably about half of that.
Yeah,
for a very comprehensive test.
Blood work is actually one of what you call in your book, The Vertical Diet, which is a fantastic book. It's one of the big rocks. Yeah. And along with regular blood work, both at baseline and then on a recurring basis.
Yeah, depending if you're, on TRT or utilizing performance-enhancing drugs, you want to get tested reasonably often. But you should at least get a baseline and then get tested. And if there's certain things in that test that you're concerned about, high or low, you want to introduce some intervention, some way to fix those things, and then get them tested within, say, 60 days later to see if you're making progress on that. I said in my Iceland seminar many, many years ago, it's got almost 7 million views now, where I went through the whole vertical diet. It's 2 full hours. I talked about the fact that if you're a personal trainer and you've got a client that just can't lose weight and you otherwise feel that they're adhering, which vast majority of the time it's over-consuming food, it might be wise to get a blood test and find out if they're hypothyroid, Hashimoto's or otherwise, because it's going to be very hard for them to lose weight. A small portion of that is because their basal metabolic rate will be lower, but a large portion of that will be because they're so fatigued that their non-exercise activity will be next to nothing. They'll just sit a lot and be tired. Same with testosterone. Very hard to gain muscle without sufficient testosterone. And if you've got a client that's in there trying to lift weights and get stronger and they just can't, you've been working with them for 30 or 60 days, and they're unable to remedy these with lifestyle changes, weight loss, improved sleep, a sleep apnea resolution with a machine, a CPAP, reduction of stress. There's a whole host of things that they can do to try and improve their testosterone or their thyroid function, their lifestyle interventions. But if those don't work, after a good 60 days, 90 days, at some point you're ripping that person off. They need to be told to see an endocrinologist and get a blood test and see if that's a factor that's causing them not to get the results they need, at which point there should be an intervention. And it's not, it's not, I don't know what term to use, but I don't think it's irresponsible to suggest that somebody may need testosterone or thyroid if they're hypogonadal or hypothyroid, particularly if it can't be remedied with lifestyle. You look at perimenopausal or postmenopausal women, very commonly they need estrogen and should to help with bone mineral density and also with how their fat's stored, because we see perimenopausal women will start to have an increase in cortisol and redirection of fat storage from the periphery into the visceral fat around the organs, and they'll start suffering some of the same problems that we see with men and visceral fat accumulation. So that's a big one.
Can you comment on, because I know you work with your clients range from professional athletes to lay people, civilians, so to speak. I posted recently on social media about, I basically shared the results of that study that found that whether you're 20 or 60, your metabolism doesn't really change all that much. And actually one cohort that seemed to have taken offense to that were the post or perimenopausal women. Mm-hmm. And they were like, how could you mansplain to us that our metabolisms don't change? I'm in menopause and I'm seeing my metabolism change. Yeah. I'm seeing fat accumulate in places where I'd never had it before.
Yeah. You're right. The research does support that our basal metabolic rate doesn't change very much. Our non-exercise activity declines significantly. Our lean muscle tissue declines significantly. And as you just mentioned, as we talked about with the menopausal women, is that their fat is getting redirected.
Interesting. So the hormones are actually influencing where the fat is being stored.
Exactly. So they should see an endocrinologist to get some estrogen therapy. I think it's recommended almost across the board now for those people, particularly because of bone mineral density. That's the number one thing, is that they'll start to see some osteopenia because estrogen is an important component of laying down osteoblasts. Obviously, sufficient protein, calcium, and resistance training. You need all of them. But
Amen.
The estrogen's a part of that process, and in the absence thereof, you're going to start to see osteoporosis accelerate, which is particularly damning for women because they already have less bone mass than men do, and generally speaking, they accumulate that in their early years. I think by the time they're 25, they've pretty much kind of topped out, and so they really need resistance training more than anyone, as I mentioned, of all ages. And
women,
women in particular,
aging women.
Yeah, and you don't get that from swimming. You don't get that from cycling. There has to be some sort of loading on the muscles. So that's why I love them, like a deadlift or a suitcase carry, or even a weighted carry, just anything that particularly loads the spine. We call axial loading. which doesn't necessarily mean they have to squat, but they're going to have to get under something that puts some pressure on those muscles of the spine, and because that's what forces the stimulus that forces the adaptation.
Specifically on the spine.
Specifically on the spine, yeah, because if you're doing bicep curls, your spine isn't, the bone isn't going to get stronger in your spine.
Whoa.
And so you actually do want to load the spine. You could do that with deadlifts or weighted carries because it all goes through the axial loading. So I try and find a movement that they'll enjoy, that they don't feel particularly exposed to injury or the like, but it needs to load them. I just like carrying dumbbells, or kettlebells, just to have them pick them up and walk them across the room.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic exercise for helping women get strong. And they should progress that over time. Yeah.
I remember when my mom was in her late 50s, she was diagnosed for osteopenia, which is like the prodrome to osteoporosis. And she just started taking one of those like caramels that have calcium in it. That's it.
Yeah.
That's what the doctor told her to do. Resistance training was never mentioned.
Minimally effective, if at all. Yeah. You need sufficient protein and the stimulus, the training stimulus.
Fascinating. Where else have you changed your views over the years? I mean, what are some other areas where you've updated your...
changed or updated, nuanced? I came out many years ago against seed oils. I did a video called "The Real Poison That's Killing Us," and I talked about those vats of deep fried foods and fries and the like. And I did disclose in that video that it is a poison to me, and I did say I'm biased because I get explosive diarrhea from seed oils. If anybody's ever had that experience to where you're trying to go to the bathroom and you got to stop and Kegel exercise, or it's going right there. That's what happens. I'll go somewhere and maybe accidentally. Hard to avoid those things. I own a meal prep company. I provide meals nationwide, and I have to source ingredients from different suppliers to make the food. And one of the things that I learned through that process is that those 5-gallon buckets of pre-mixed egg are often adulterated, mixed with canola oil or soybean oil.
No way.
Yeah. I think it's primarily as a preservative, but it's also probably a cost thing because that's a lot cheaper than eggs. And I don't know how much of it is adulterated, but and so it caused me to think back to any time I'd eat at like a Denny's or a IHOP. I just wanted to get scrambled eggs. And I'd ask them to make them dry, as dry as they could. I didn't want a bunch of butter or oil on them. I just wanted scrambled eggs. I would still end up with that reaction.
That's a good tip, by the way. You just go to a restaurant if you want scrambled eggs, ask for them dry.
You can ask for them dry, yeah. But unless the 5-gallon bucket they're ladling the eggs out of is adulterated with oil.
Right.
For a susceptible individual. I'm cautious to say, not everybody has this problem. I always said it's individualistic, it's dose dependent. I say that about peanuts for people with the peanut allergy. You say that about some fish. There's a whole host of allergies. Some people are allergic to milk. Others have an intolerance. It's dose dependent. So I should have been more cautious about painting with a broad brush as to my experience, and that was specific to vegetable oils. I was allergic to them. Having said that, because there's been a lot of literature recently that this whole concept of omega-6 fatty acids being linoleic acid in particular, there's been a lot of claims about them being inflammatory, et cetera, et cetera. We just don't have any evidence of that in the research. In human trials and outcome trials, we just don't have any evidence of that. And we also see that when you replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats like canola oil, you decrease LDL. The problem with that is that's nice in theory, but in practice, the vast majority of those oils are consumed in ultra-processed foods and in deep fat fryers.
Yeah.
Deep fat fryers are toxic. Reheated oils are toxic. We have plenty of good human research to show that. I hate to use the word toxic, but they do increase cardiovascular disease risk. And ultra-processed foods, as we know, is probably the foundation of our obesity crisis. Ultra-processed foods.
Absolutely.
We know from much of the research that eating an equivalent amount of whole foods versus ultra-processed foods, you simply overconsume. They don't have the satiety benefit. just overeat them to the tune of, say, 500 calories a day, as you've seen in the literature.
Wow.
So if you want to put your finger on anything, it's not any one particular food. It's that whole ultra-processed, highly palatable food environment, which is typically high fat, high sugar, high salt. So it's not just a carbohydrate. It's not like people are overeating bags of sugar. It's the combination of those things in your pastries, etc., that we're over-consuming, that don't provide us a satiety signal. That's where the vast majority of seed oils are being consumed, up to 70%. I actually reached out and asked Tucker Goodrich to debate Alan Flanagan on Mark Bell's show about seed oils. And it was probably the point at which I changed from hating seed oils in their entirety to classifying them as either part of ultra-processed foods or deep-fried foods, and I left alone the oil itself. Nobody's drizzling canola oil on their salad, I guess is my point.
I mean, some are, though. If you look at most commercial dressings in the supermarket, right?
Yep.
The oil used
the cheap ones, I think by choice they would go to extra virgin olive oil.
Like you find some of these like artisanal looking commercial salad dressings. I think Newman's Own.
Yeah.
It's a fairly common supermarket
Right.
staple. And the primary oil is it's either canola or soybean or one of those,
Yeah. I think that's a lot smaller portion of the calories that are consumed under that. But hats off to Tucker for taking that challenge. He's very up to speed on the data, but unfortunately, the research that he presented just didn't pan out, didn't support. So I like to, offering the proper nuance. I'm trying to excuse myself by any stretch of the imagination. I learned a lot over the years myself. That'd probably be the one that I came out the harshest against. And a lot of that came from, I think, was it Sally Fallon and Mary Enig of the articles that they wrote for the Weston A. Price Foundation. So this is information that, Mary Enig was a PhD. There's a lot of information that I've acquired over the years from different professionals that I've come to learn sometimes they have their own bias, and that the body of literature, when you look at the hierarchy of evidence, you have to go past the individual professionals and start to look at the randomized controlled trials, and then look at the systematic reviews of those, and to see where the science lies. As we discussed earlier with the Cochrane reviews of systematic reviews of saturated fat, it's easy to pick and choose the studies that fit your particular bias.
Yeah.
And, we all may have a tendency to do that from time to time, or listen to a particular individual who shares your bias and just, what would you say, just appeal to his authority or her authority, whereas they might not be an authority, or they may have their own bias. One place I found this to be exposed was on redpenreviews.org. Have you been in there? Redpenreviews.org is a number of PhD nutritionists that analyze nutrition books. They actually go in and look at the body of literature and compare it to what the author claims. And oftentimes they'll find that the citations that the author offers to support their recommendations are either not relative or not valid, and they'll offer up a scoring system. Go to redpenreviews.org and you can scroll down and see some of the most popular books written by MDs and find them to be horribly scored sometimes.
Yeah.
15, 17, 25% accuracy.
Jeez.
And they use a host of different variables to score those books, including healthfulness, accuracy, a host of different things. It's pretty eye-opening.
Yeah. There's a lot of faulty information out there, particularly in the world of diet books. And truth be told, medical doctors are not necessarily nutrition experts. And yet,
agreed,
many of the top-selling nutrition books are written by medical doctors that have no specific training in the field of nutrition. I'm pretty familiar with that site. I think it was founded by Stephan Guyenet or something? Is that how you pronounce his name?
Yeah, Stephan
Yeah,
Guyenet.
he's like an obesity researcher.
He even said something interesting, if this was part of his, let me look him up here.
Yeah.
With respect to seed oils. Yeah, he said here, I feel the evidence behind the hypothesis that seed oils promote obesity due to their linoleic acid content has largely collapsed. But
Yeah.
I think they promote obesity because they're used to increase the reward palatability value of processed food. So he kind of fell into the same thing I put in my book 2 years ago.
Yeah.
I don't know how recent that quote was, but I just I had revised my original vertical diet, it's in the 3.0 currently. And as I've expanded my vertical diet ebook from when I originally launched it, it's now become the 2.0, now the 3.0, and I have the 4.0 coming out soon. And I give a copy of the updated version to everybody who's bought a previous version. So it's a living document.
I love it.
Where I make these changes and I add more chapters based on the kinds of questions I'm getting from clients. Like yourself, I've had over 100,000 DMs in the last 5 years from people. And I endeavor to answer as many as I can. And I copy and paste articles and I refer them to the professionals. I hope that here I'm saying at the end of this conversation that I hope that nobody thinks that I present myself here as a domain-specific expert on any of these topics.
I think you're brilliant.
I'm regurgitating the information that I've learned that I want my clients to know because they don't have the time or the energy to, and maybe they don't have the scientific acumen. I have a degree in science from the University of Oregon. I've studied calculus and statistics and chemistry and biology, and so I have at least enough knowledge to be dangerous, I suppose.
Yeah, but I mean, if even amongst academics, if all you were allowed to comment on was the primary literature that you yourself published, then
Right.
where would we be in terms of
and that's
science
the point.
communication?
My book is a compilation of resources. I'll tell them, I kind of put it in a bit of a checklist and a hierarchy of most important to least important, and then I refer them to videos, articles, and peer-reviewed published research that supports, if they intend to take that deep dive. I want them to get, they're like, Stan, tell me exactly what to eat. And then if they have a question, I like to think that I've addressed it in there based on all of the questions that I've received over the years. And I point people to these particular references that I think are, as mentioned, people who have a domain-specific expertise. We see some people that will get on a podcast and talk about a certain topic and make some extraordinary claims. We've seen a lot of folks that they'll use some plausible or possible biomechanistic explanation, but then they'll make these giant logical leaps into these outcomes and try and apply percentages to them. And they're oftentimes it isn't proven in human outcome trials that there's any benefit to what they're suggesting. They're just talking about a plausible mechanism of action or a mouse study or.
I agree. And I agree with everything you've said thus far. But I will add that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah.
And so for a food, specifically a novel food, and I've changed, and I'll because I think I owe it to my listeners to get into where I've evolved my views on this. I think a food category like these refined, bleached, deodorized seed oils that have only been on the market for 50 to 100 years, and our consumption of them has just skyrocketed. Yeah. I mean, we have short-term randomized control trials where we can see that when you replace saturated fat with them, you see a decrease in this one biomarker, ApoB, which hypothetically is going to reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. Although it does change the quality of those particles compared to monounsaturated fat, the polyunsaturated fats, the potentially oxidized forms which you ingest might change the quality of those ApoB particles, which I don't know. I have no idea how that plays out over the long term.
Yeah.
But that being said, I completely agree, and I've evolved in the sense that I think that singling them out as the boogeyman today in the context of the standard American food environment is misguided. Most people have much bigger fish to fry, and ultimately that big fish is reducing the consumption of ultra-processed foods. Yeah. And it's the confluence of it's just added fats in general, it's the refined grains, it's the added sugar, and it's all that stuff.
Yeah, and you don't have to eat them. I'm not suggesting. I don't put them in my diet. I don't recommend them to anybody.
Yeah.
I would look at my diet in particular, I'm talking about the vertical diet, which is really just kind of, more than just food. I would say, what would I replace what would I take out of my diet and put a seed oil in for? I think just about everything that I've selected has been intentionally, particularly for weight loss. Let's say you have to eat 1,600 calories to lose weight. That's a small amount of calories. Those 1,600 calories better be high impact.
Yeah.
They better supply sufficient protein, gram of protein per pound of lean weight, 30+% of total calories. They better provide adequate, all the other micronutrients, 1,000 milligrams of calcium, 4,700 milligrams of potassium, sufficient iron, all those things, biotin, choline. They better supply all of those things. If I take any of those foods out and replace them with a canola oil.
With oil, yeah.
Even though you'd like to suggest that somebody leaves a little room for a flexible dieting, as Alan Aragon recommends.
Love him.
He's great.
Yeah.
And so that you don't binge on something that you're abstaining from. Although some people, they can't. What's the Pringles? Once you pop, you can't stop. So I'm cautious. I have to ask you: are you the kind of individual that once you pop, you can't stop? Or if I give you, 3 chips a day, can you just eat those? And will that prevent you from binging long term? People are different. There's a lot of individual variability with that.
So do you do any added fat whatsoever? I mean, are you a fan of extra virgin olive oil? Do you use butter? I mean, we've already kind of talked about the butter.
A little bit. I'll just dress a pan with it.
Got it.
But again, if I throw a bunch of butter in, what do I have to pull out?
Right.
Particularly in a diet. Or if I'm trying to get somebody to gain a significant amount of weight and they're in a huge calorie surplus, I'm pretty cautious about how many fats I throw in there because particularly saturated fat. We see even equating for calories, we can accumulate intrahepatic fat preferentially from saturated fat usage as opposed to alternative fats. So when I'm bulking someone, I remember I said I diet them down to restore their metabolic health, lower their blood pressure, decrease their fatty liver, et cetera, blood sugar reduction. Well, when I bulk them back up, there's a host of things I like to do to prevent them from accumulating that fatty liver again. Getting sufficient choline, of course, is a big thing for that. Getting a CPAP is huge. Lowering their saturated fat intake.
What's a CPAP?
That helps you. It's for sleep apnea. It's a machine that you wear. Yeah. Continuous positive air pressure, which are actually BiPAPs now. They put air in, and then when you exhale, they relieve. And that's an intervention that I have to utilize with a lot of athletes who are north of, say, 230, 240, they start to get some crowding of the airway from a thick neck from lifting. Even Jordan Fagenbaum from Barbell Medicine is 198 pounds.
Whoa.
He wears a CPAP. He's got a thick neck from squatting. It's about crowded airway. My mom was 112 pounds. She had a CPAP. She had a problem with her getting in enough air so she could breathe at night. And that's huge. That'll raise your blood pressure potentially 20 points. It'll increase your blood thickness. It'll cause increase
risk for Alzheimer's disease,
risk for Alzheimer's disease. There's a whole host of things that if you snore and wake up tired, there's a good chance you have some degree of apnea. You should probably go get tested and get diagnosed and see if it's sufficient enough to warrant getting a machine. Weight loss is the number one way to cure that, but if in the absence of a significant, and some of my athletes don't want to lose weight, and some people like Jordan are already 12% body fat, and he's not going to have any benefit from weight loss.
Well, it's not even just adiposity you're saying that can influence it. It's like you have some of these like highly muscled individuals who are
crowding of the airway,
also suffering. Wow.
Yeah. So those are all techniques that I use. 10-minute walks. We haven't touched on those yet today, and those have been a foundation of my program for a decade now.
Tell me.
Well, after each meal, I have my clients take a 10-minute walk. It improves the muscular contraction and enzymatic action for digestion. It lowers blood sugar, twice as effective as metformin for decreasing or preventing type 2 diabetes. And this is in human randomized controlled trial research. It decreases the postprandial glycemia, the peak and duration, what they call the area under the curve, of your blood sugar elevation post-meal, because your muscles will absorb glucose from the bloodstream in the absence of the need of insulin. So we always recommend that you eat a meal, take a 10-minute walk.
Probably also postprandial lipemia, which is a term I recently learned, but that post-meal fat in the blood as well.
Yeah. So I'm a big proponent of that. I do that all the time. one of the biggest reasons is obviously we know that non-exercise activity thermogenesis is one of the ways that people burn the most calories, potentially can burn the most calories in a day. And that's just your activity level, as opposed to exercise activity thermogenesis. That actually burns fewer calories in a day than your non-exercise activity. That's why I'm cautious about assigning these aggressive training programs, and when people go into the gym and they crush themselves with battle ropes and burpees, because they come home and compensation occurs. They sit more and eat more. They're hungrier and they're tired. And that, as mentioned earlier when I talked about Hashimoto's or hypothyroidism, that causes people to just sit more during the day, and that's where a significant amount of your calories are burned. It'd be the difference between a construction worker or a waitress as opposed to somebody who had a sedentary job.
Yeah.
And that could be 1,000, 1,500 calories for an active individual. It's huge, whereas an hour of cardio might only be 300 calories or thereabouts, depending on the intensity of that. And over time, of course, your body adapts and reduces, it becomes more efficient at the number of calories that it burns during exercise activity. So I'm always promoting step count.
Yeah.
Get your 8,000 steps or 6,000 steps a day. But the 10-minute walk, for me, is remember I said adherence is important. I coined a term some years ago called compliance is the science.
I love that.
It's been repeated throughout the industry, and I'm always proud when it is, because it really, at the end of the day, when I say the best diet's the one you'll follow, the best exercise is the one you'll do, 10-minute walks is something where you can accumulate the necessary number of steps or the amount of cardiovascular exercise that's recommended for the 150 minutes a week, and it's easy to do. There's no barrier to entry. You don't got to get changed, get in your car, drive to the gym, get on a treadmill. Things that are easily dismissed over time with jobs and families and hectic schedules. You can get up in the morning, take a 10-minute walk. Before you go to bed at night, you can just go out and take a 10-minute walk. I've got a recumbent bike in my dad's room. He's 93 years old. When he eats, I asked him to go over and sit on the bike and just move the pedals a little bit. Helps with his blood sugars. When I travel, I can do that in the hotel. I can walk up and down the stairs. It's anywhere. When I get to the airport, everybody's standing around staring at the baggage claim that's not moving. I'm zipping around. I look like an idiot. I'm walking around,
doing laps,
and it's deliberate for me now. It's intentional. I swing my arms a little bit. I get my heart rate up a little bit. I breathe a little bit, but it's not a workout. I'm not asking you to sweat like crazy, but it's something that I've been able to maintain, sustainable, for many, many years now. I can consistently do. I do 30 minutes of cardio a day. I do it in the form of 10-minute walks. I had my Uber drop me off down the corner at the coffee shop, and it was a 7-minute walk to here. Of course, the airport's always a great place because it's lengthy between the time you park to the time you're at your gate. I use that as an opportunity to walk fast. But I'd encourage that. I don't assign cardio to any of my clients. I assign 10-minute walks.
That's amazing.
I think they're sustainable, and I think they have the extra benefits, particularly because we know that one 30-minute bout exercise at the end of the day is not as effective as 3 10-minute bouts during the day. Like sitting is the new smoking kind of thing. They want you to get up and move around more often throughout the day. So,
correct me if I'm wrong, but also walking doesn't. One of the reasons why it's such a powerful fat loss modality is that it doesn't increase rebound hunger the way.
Yeah, that's the compensation I was talking about.
The compensation, yeah. So like running, you might burn the same amount of calories running, but you're going to be hungrier.
It might make you hungry.
It might make you hungry.
Some people find that, yeah.
But walking doesn't. It doesn't increase your appetite.
Yeah, Dr. Aaron Carroll, I think he's the dean of research at Indiana. He wrote a book called Good Food, Bad Food. But he has a video on YouTube called More Exercise Does Not Equal More Weight Loss. And it's a great, but he talks about the compensation effect and how your body adapts to cardio over time and downregulates the number of calories it burns. And he said that, I think he was referring to The Biggest Loser. He said if The Biggest Loser was just shot after shot of people not overeating, it would be pretty boring. But you lose body fat in the kitchen, and your exercise should be for your heart health and cardiovascular fitness. But if you start to try and count calories for exercise, for energy expenditure for exercise, it's kind of not a very effective method, as you mentioned, for a couple of reasons.
Wow. All right. Well, before we wrap up, I do want to do a little bit of rapid fire Q&A because I did poll my Instagram audience. So I got some great questions.
I'll try and keep them shorter. I tend to be long-winded.
Yeah, no, you're great.
So much
dude.
nuance to all this stuff. I don't want to, in these academic folks, I don't want to be on Lane's Fuckery Friday. I have to be cautious.
I mean, really, who
step
does?
out of line here.
I know, right? I mean, you get that cackle.
Mm-hmm.
He's I mean, I have a ton of respect for him.
Great resource.
But dude, you are a triple threat. I mean, bodybuilder, strong as hell, and brilliant. Like your ability to synthesize research, science, I think is just so incredible.
I've learned so much from the people I've worked with over the years. I still work with folks, so it's been a great opportunity for me, I think.
Yeah. Well, all right, so let's take some questions from my Instagram audience because I have a wonderful audience on Instagram. And the first one comes from Pistachio Joe. Does he even lift? Gotta love the internet.
Yeah.
Gotta love the internet.
I love lifting. And I've been lifting for, hard since I was a teenager. But I understand that not everybody likes lifting.
How'd you first discover lifting?
I think it was my dad bought me one of those Weider weight sets with the plastic coated, concrete filled, and I just started lifting. I just wanted to be jacked. I was a skinny kid. I was 98
you said
pounds.
your genetics weren't even that, like, you didn't think that your genetics were
Well, I had delayed onset puberty as a result of from a few reasons. I worked at 7-Eleven when I was a teenager. By the time I was 12, the time I was 16, so I was eating like nacho cheese pumped food and hot dogs and soda pop was my diet, and I was working the swing shift, so I wouldn't get home till 1 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
And so I didn't have sufficient sleep. I didn't have sufficient food intake. And so there I was, 17 years old, never been through puberty. And I moved to my grandfather's place in Pennsylvania for my senior year of high school. And I started drinking raw milk from the cows, steaks and bacon and eggs every night, and sleeping hard. And next thing you know, I put on 30 pounds. I went from like 115 to 145. And I finally had gone through puberty. But I was still undersized in college, being 140, 145 pounds as
Wow.
an 18-year-old freshman. Then spending 2 years lifting and putting on probably less than 12 or 13 pounds. And I finally discovered at 20 years old with the hypogonadal from varicocele. So that's kind of the history of that.
I think I might have that as well.
Yeah.
I had a surgery a couple years ago.
Yeah.
On my nuts. And they found they saw like a mild.
It's a vein that doesn't drain, and so it'll cause an increase in heat around the testicles, because it could potentially decrease your testosterone levels. It's not for everyone. I mean, you can have varicocele and not have a lowered testosterone. Sounds like your testosterone's fine.
Yeah, it's good. I had
it can be uncomfortable.
I had intermittent testicular torsion. I don't recommend that to anybody.
Yeah.
But I had a procedure a couple years ago called an orchiopexy.
Yeah.
Which was it's never happened since. So. Thank God for modern medicine.
Yeah, those are painful.
Yeah, super painful. Okay, next question. Sofia Garcia Payares, I hope I pronounced that right, asked, is it safe for your kidney so much protein?
Yeah.
Is a high-protein diet kidney safe?
Yeah. I want to say, who's the president of the ISSN? Dr. Jose Antonio has done some protein overfeeding research, plenty of it, up to... I want to say 3 and 4 grams per pound, which she had a hard time getting compliance with. But even up to 2 grams per pound of body weight, we don't see any evidence that a kidney that's not compromised, not otherwise compromised, if you have poor kidney health, you want to reduce your protein, but otherwise your body can excrete it.
Good to know. Good to know. I'm going to combine two questions here because I think they're kind of similar. So we got BDDDDD74 and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Tera. The latter asked, how to build muscles as a hard gaining, naturally thin woman, and then the former asked advice for hard gainers. So basically, we'll combine the two, and for people that find it really difficult to gain muscle.
First and foremost, it's easiest in a calorie surplus with sufficient protein, and sufficient protein could be 1.6 grams per pound of body weight. That could be sufficient. I actually don't like to feed too much protein to people who are trying to gain weight because it might inhibit their ability to eat enough calories. Calories is more important than protein at that point.
So bring your protein down potentially.
A little bit, because it's satiating. It has a high thermic effect of food, so you're netting out fewer total calories per protein consumed. You eat 100 calories of protein, you might only net out 70 calories. So I actually bring protein down a little bit for people who have a hard time eating enough. Get into a calorie surplus. That's the single most important thing consistently. Again, back to Dr. Jose Antonio, the president of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, recommends 4 evenly spaced meals a day, protein feedings a day, and you'd like to get at least 20 grams of protein per meal to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Obviously more if you're a larger individual to get your total for the day, which is most important. once you have satisfied that and getting sufficient sleep, the training stimulus is what's most important. What I find with a lot of women is they'll exercise and not train. I don't think that they train with a sufficient amount of intensity, which means that you want to get within a rep or two of failure. So if you do 10 reps and you could have done 15, or God forbid 20, it's not a sufficient stimulus. And so you need to whatever weight you choose, whether it's a 85% of your 1 rep max, a heavy load, and you can only lift it 5 times, or if it's 50% of your 1 rep max, a much lighter load, and you can lift it 20 times, you get equivalent hypertrophy outcome, presuming you take each of those to within a rep or two of failure. So I'm not too concerned about the load necessarily, but I'm more concerned about the intensity. How close are you getting to failure? And then you want to train every body part twice a week, particularly those larger body parts or the ones that you can accumulate more muscle tissue faster. A whole lot of bicep work or side delt work isn't going to be as effective as, say, back, chest, or legs in terms of just adding muscle to your body overall. You like to get trained twice a week, and then probably 10 to 20 total sets per week. So at least 5 sets if you're going on chest day. Let's pick 2 exercises and do 3 sets of each. That's 6 sets. So that's sufficient. You probably do a little less, but you might not be able to get much benefit from doing too much more. I have a chart in the Vertical Diet 3.0 ebook. It's called Evidence-Based Guidelines for Hypertrophy. And it goes step by step by step down to frequency, volume, load, effort, rest time, which exercises probably lend themselves best, multi-joint exercises. Probably the last thing would be range of motion. You want to work through a significant or a full range of motion, get a lengthened position on the muscle to maximize hypertrophy.
I've been really, because that's kind of trending these days, that concept, right? Yeah. And I've been really focusing on the eccentric when the muscle is at its most lengthened.
100%.
And I've seen actually some pretty epic results from that.
Yeah, very effective. Women in particular, and I don't mean to single them out. I know some women who train incredibly hard. I'll scroll through a client's Instagram and look at their workouts, and I can just call them out right on the spot. I'll tell them, or I'll forward it to them and have them look at it and say that set did not sufficiently stimulate hypertrophy, and be cautious with junk volume. It's not exercise; it's training. And a lot of people go in, they'll cross T's and dot I's. Specific example: you go over the incline dumbbell press, and you grab the 40s and you do 10 reps. And then you rest and you grab the 50s and you do 10 reps. And then you rest for a bit and you grab the 60s and you do 10 reps. And you rest for a bit. Then you grab the 80s and you barely eke out 7, and maybe your spotter had to help you 1. You didn't do 4 sets. You did 1. The others, those 10, 10, 10, those are warm-ups essentially. So I would suggest that you actually just get kind of warmed up. Maybe you do 2 with the 40s, 2 with the 50s, 2 with the 60s. I'd also suggest you rest sufficiently between sets. This is very common. I work with a lot of fighters, John Jones, Henry Cejudo, and they tend to want to go too fast, and women too. They try to turn the gym experience into a workout, battle ropes and burpees. They want to sweat and they want to breathe hard. I got a lot done. I burned a lot of calories. It's not what the gym experience is for. It's not how you build muscle. It's a completely different stimulus. So you want to rest long enough, minimum of 2, sometimes 3+ minutes between large body groups. Each subsequent set, you should get pretty close to the same number of reps as the first set when you were fresh. And that's a good way to indicate if you're dropping off really fast from 12 to 9 to 6 reps because you're only giving yourself 30-second rest, you're training something else. Muscular endurance, lactate clearance, that kind of thing. Cardiovascular fitness, you're training something else. You're not giving the optimal stimulus for muscle growth.
Wow. Yeah. So keep your resistance training, and keep your cardio.
I get a little frustrated with all the functional training fuckery that's been going on recently. Then people try and combine your strength training with your sports-specific work, and they get in there. And you don't get great at either that way. It's a very specific stimulus, and let's optimize that. A lot of this stuff comes from Brad Schoenfeld's book, Hypertrophy. He's one of the most foremost respected researchers in the world on this topic.
He's great.
He's great. He's got a whole book on it. He just walks you through it step by step. I created the chart. Follow those guidelines closely.
I want to tease out also the intensity making sure that you're training intensely enough for women, which I think is, for me, I live in Los Angeles, so I see, women will literally, not to single out women, although this just happens to be the case where I live, women will show up and it's less likely to be men that do this, will show up to the gym in makeup. Yeah. And they're trying to keep their cute faces on for the entirety of their set. And I'm like, ladies, you got to leave your cute face at home. Come to the gym to train and train hard. And it's not necessarily going to look cute, but that's the degree of intensity that adaptation requires.
That's one way you can tell if you've worked hard enough, because you cannot finish a sufficient set without grimacing. You just can't. Try it. You cannot do it.
Oh, yeah.
Oftentimes, I'll have a female client who will get under a particular exercise and be, how many reps? And my answer is all the reps.
All the reps.
All the reps. And I want to wait until I see a significant decrease in speed, because then I know all the muscle fibers have been recruited and some are dropping off because they're failing. It's probably sufficient stimulus. You see a really significant decline in speed. Although I will tell you this, women in particular, they'll get under a weight, and on the third rep, it'll look like they've maybe got one left, and they'll do 5 more.
Wow.
It's pretty incredible. Brittany Diamond was at the Mr. Olympia. I had a rhino cage. It's kind of like the animal cage. I had the rhino cage, and we had a bunch of lifters come from all over the country, savages. And I think she squatted, I want to say 315 for 15. Ridiculous.
Wow.
And boy, I hope I got that correct, because there were a ton of lifters there. By rep 6, I thought maybe she was going to get 8 or 9. It's phenomenal to watch an experienced female lifter grind. They're able to, men, alternatively, a woman can do 315 for 15, and if you go to 350, she might only be at 1 or 2. That's an exaggeration. Men don't have the same endurance, but tend to have a higher top side.
Interesting. So they're stronger up front.
Yeah, you just they seem to have more pounds left in the tank when they slow down for a single. Whereas it's fascinating to watch the difference between the two.
Wow. Get ugly, boys and girls.
Yes.
I love that. All right, last question. I think this is a good question. KASZKA asks, how do you maintain flexibility while building muscle?
It's a good topic, and it's going to upset some people. And I've probably already done that to all the other topics we've gone on.
We love it.
There is no indication that stretching reduces injury, aids in recovery, reduces DOMS, improves performance. There's no indication of that in any of the research. It may actually decrease performance if you stretch too close to training. That's why you don't see sprinters stretching their hamstrings. I'm talking about a static hold for 30 seconds plus. It relaxes the muscles to the point you want those muscles to be tight and be able to respond. It relieves some of that stretch reflex that you're familiar with, the muscle spindle, where you load the muscle and it snaps back. Range of motion, flexibility, should be trained under load. Reason being is we have some good research that suggests with dancers and gymnasts that when you static stretch in the absence of load, you actually increase your exposure to injury risk because those end ranges aren't strong. And so I would suggest that you lift through a full range of motion. We've seen in the research equivalent flexibility outcomes from lifting through a full range of motion with an improvement in injury prevention from loading that lift. I'm talking about heavy load. I'm just talking about some sort of load. If your calves, say, maybe you're on a standing calf press or something, you just go all the way down, but you're under load. And that would be an example. I think people have made some extraordinary claims about stretching over the years. It's just not supported by the science.
It feels good, though.
It feels good.
Yeah.
And then I would say, and I'm not the one who says this, this is coming from Professor Michael Ray, a chiropractor who was worked with barbell medicine for years, and I would suggest that the time that you invest into a static stretch, what does that come at the cost of? What's the cost benefit? The benefit is it feels good, because I just described that there's no other benefit. And the cost is that maybe you could have done something more productive with that time. Or maybe you were paying somebody to stretch you.
Yeah.
And it's unnecessary. And I would also caution that stretching's not a great idea for injury rehab. That it's kind of passive, and you want to do active for injury rehab. Some of the best recommendation for recovery is any kind of movement. Greg Nuckols spoke about this. We see this in the research, that any kind of movement, all the passive therapies pale in comparison. When I say passive therapy, I mean anything that's done to you or for you, whether it's electric stem or gua sha or dry needling or massaging, those are minimally effective. I consider therapists, physiotherapists, chiropractors, and the like, to be facilitators of movement. A good therapist will, either through distraction or even manipulation, if it's of benefit to you, find a way to allow you to move that area with less pain so you're not inhibited. Greg Nuckols said that when people experience pain, they become kinesiophobic. They just stop moving. That's the biggest problem. Pat Davidson posted on that today. Dr. Pat Davidson, PhD, exercise phys. He said when people hurt their back, they stop moving. It's exactly the opposite of what you want to do. You want to shorten the range of motion and the load and find some sort of movement that you can do with relatively little pain, and then keep moving. There's a professor out of Barr, Keith Barr, I believe is his name, and he's out of Southern Cal, UC Davis. I'm not sure. Boy, I hope I don't butcher all these. There's too many names to remember. He's proposed that for rehab that you do 3 10-minute sessions about 6 hours apart, something about the fibers needing a sufficient recovery time. But he would suggest that, say, if you had a shoulder injury, you would just move it. You'd find some range of motion and some load that didn't cause pain, and you would move it as much as you can for about 10 minutes. Could include a little bit of resistance. A knee would be the same thing. If you were to get on a recumbent bike under a little bit modest tension and maybe go a little, maybe 30, 40 seconds and then rest for 15 and do that 10 times. I had chronic knee tendonitis for damn near 10 years, and hips, and I've torn damn near every muscle in my body, of course, from powerlifting. So rehab has been and I used to outsource that a lot, and I found I just didn't recover nearly as well as when I would start moving. Remember, I had 2 surgeons say I needed a hip replacement surgery.
Wow.
And it was the kind where I had to pick my leg up to get it out of the car. It was so much pain. It would throb at night. I'd be on airplanes grinding it like this because it was just so much pain. People have felt that they're in the knees, They're like rubbing their knees because they're just, the tendonitis is so bad. They can't sit in a theater or a car for an extended period of time. A tendonitis type feeling. I asked Eddie Cohn where he got his hip replacement surgery done, because I was about ready to go get one. He did it overseas so he could get both a titanium ball and a titanium neck, because he wanted a 1,500-pound tensile strength instead of 700, because he wanted to squat again. And he said, go to Mark Philippi. Mark Philippi is former pro strongman, was a strength and conditioning coach for UNLV football team, and he has a Philippi Strength Institute in Las Vegas. I went to Mark Philippi, and I have the whole video on Stan Efferding mobility with Mark Philippi, where he rehabbed me over the course of 6 weeks. And my hip was bad. I couldn't squat at all. And we went through some rehabilitation. It was some bands. It was some kettlebells. It was just movement. And at home, I remember I was in Hawaii during this period. I went for a week with my wife, and I remember standing out front while she was at one of those shopping centers, and I was holding onto a bike rack, and I was just swinging my leg to the side. That's all I could do. Same as I showed you with the arm. I was just standing there, finding a range of motion. I say, take what your body gives you. Finding a range of motion where I didn't have any pain, and I could repeat the movement over and over and over again. Blood. Okay? That's the motion is the lotion. Blood is the life force. To get the blood in there. Because your joints, particularly the cartilaginous structures inside, they're not innervated by capillaries, so that you don't get a lot of blood in there. The blood is pushed in there through movement.
Wow. That's
how you get the bad stuff out and the good stuff in, is through movement. It's like a sponge. Sucks it up, expels it, but it's only when you move it. Eric Spoto, 722-pound bench presser, training partner of mine for many years. He got a shoulder surgery. They sent him home with a machine. The machine moved his arm for 4 hours a day. He didn't rehab.
Wow.
Because the machine did the work for him. It was passive, not active. And he wasn't recovering. Another friend with a knee surgery, he got one of those game readies, put it on his knee, and it was just ice and pressure. After about a month of that, and he was disciplined with it. He was doing it every single day. His doctor said, stop doing that. You're not recovering. It wasn't healing. Ice prevents the necessary inflammatory response, and he wasn't moving the knee.
There you go. Interesting.
So, I don't know if I'm trailing off too far, but
no, I love this though.
All of this is good information for rehab. Things that are done to you or for you, never as effective as things you do for yourself. Use your therapist as a facilitator of movement, and then move. It's your responsibility. 3 times a day, 10 minutes a time, and you'll rehabilitate much quicker. The neat thing about pain is, which is what industry I should have gotten into instead of weight loss, because our recidivism rate is north of 80-90% of people gain back their weight loss within 3 years. 50%
huge proportion
within 1 year, huge proportion. The numbers are pain's much different. 95% of pain resolves itself spontaneously in 4 to 6 weeks.
Wow.
Doing nothing. Although I would suggest that you'd heal much faster if you'd move. So whatever therapist you go to, I mentioned a whole bunch, you go to 10 different therapists, you get 10 different diagnoses and 10 different treatment protocols, and everyone will recover within 4 to 6, 95% of them will recover within 4 to 6 weeks, including the guy that gives you a copper bracelet and tells you to wear that. And the thing that's interesting about that is that the individual who's being treated in whatever manner will attribute their recovery to whatever intervention that they experienced and swear by it, right? Including the copper bracelet.
Yeah.
Even though they may have spontaneously recovered, even in the absence or with any of the practitioners. That's not to say there aren't better practitioners than others, but I think the best ones.
It's confirmation bias right there, right?
A little bit of placebo. I think the best ones are really good at explaining to people, returning them to normalcy as quickly as possible, graduating, we say finding a point of entry, facilitating movement, and then getting them to move and progressing that over time. The challenge is that if you do too much, you don't know till you wake up the next day. And you're like, oh,
yes,
that's the challenge. And then you got to step back, start over again. It's a gradual process.
Yeah, I mean, it's been my life for the past decade struggling with chronic low back pain.
Yeah.
But who doesn't these days have some form of pain? Usually it's the back. It's back pain. Yeah. Back pain is so common.
It's number one. And I think one of the best people on that, about everything that I just talked about, is probably Austin Baraki.
Ooh, never heard of him.
At Barbell Medicine. He writes an article. You can just Google it on the internet and read it. It's fascinating. It's fantastic. And it's called Pain in Training, What to Do. It's the biopsychosocial method. I learned that from them when I went to the Barbell Medicine seminar many years ago. And it comes from the research from, I believe, from Dr. Larimer Mosley out of Australia, who has a series of books called Explain Pain Recharged or Supercharged. Fascinating stuff. There's a video of Dr. Larimer Mosley talking about pain on YouTube. Talks about people's perception of pain and how the mind is a defense mechanism to where the pain may not be anything that is what we say tissue damage in particular. I'm not describing this very well. I'm kind of losing it. But the brain has experienced some trauma and is protecting you to the point where it will defend you such that until such time that you can desensitize. That's why I talk about distraction therapy and placebo. Sometimes when people touch you, you provide some relief, and then you can move. But it's the movement. It's not necessarily the intervention. The intervention facilitated the movement. It's the movement itself, whether it's back or shoulder or hip or knee. And it's a fascinating field.
Yeah, the motion is the lotion.
Yeah.
I love it. I love getting a chiropractic adjustment. I love chiropractors and the good ones, and
very knowledgeable. Probably one of the most knowledgeable on the physiology of the body or the anatomy of the body for sure.
I have a good friend. Shout out to Paul Braun in L.A. He's the best chiropractor.
Yeah,
best chiropractor I've ever seen, and we became friends. And just super, super talented guy. And then massage, I think, is incredible.
Yeah, it feels good. It's 100%. I'm not trying to shit on any of those interventions because it relieves stress. People have a perception of relief of soreness, although there's not really a measurable physiological benefit other than the psychological benefit. That can be very important in a competitive nature. When same with, say, icing. You know, I'm not a big fan of icing immediately following training. We see it inhibits hypertrophy. But if it also inhibits the pain signal and allows you to perform without reservation in the short term, so you got 2 games in 3 nights or that kind of thing, or, you know, a softball tournament over the weekend, whatever. If employing one of these interventions allows psychologically for you to feel less pain, then you aren't inhibited when you go out and perform your sport, then I think that's a reasonable.
But you also don't want to like move. You don't want to like. You don't want to not listen to the pain and continue to do something.
It's an important signal,
right? Like you want to listen to the signal.
Yeah, and then it's
like if something hurts in the gym, you want to not do that, ideally, right?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, there's a video with Austin Baraki training with Alan Thrall, where they were deadlifting, and Alan hurt his back, an acute injury, just hurt his back. Felt one of those stingers. He's like, Alan was going to quit for the day and go rest. Austin lowered the weight, elevated it off the floor, and made him continue to do deadlifts, which is what I'm recommending as well. Find a point of entry that's where the pain is minimal, where you can continue to move, and then start to gradually progress that from there. You'll wake up the next morning, you'll be sore, there's no question. That's common as the fluid dissipates from your spine overnight. And until you get up and walk around or get in the shower, you know, it's going to relieve itself, but then you just got to keep moving. Keep moving. It's the most important thing.
Love it. Well, this seems like
never ends, does it?
Never ends. No. You're a wealth of information. I've learned a ton. This was so fun. And as somebody who's like a closet meathead bodybuilder himself, I love, you know, I'm so grateful for the opportunity that you've given me to nerd out with you for the past 2 hours.
I appreciate you calling, man. That was great. Or send me a DM. And if anybody has any questions about any of this stuff, you know, oftentimes people comment and when the YouTube gets sent out, and I don't really read the YouTube comments as diligently, but I do read my DMs.
Yeah.
And if anything that I
mentioned,
mentioned,
out of the comments, bro.
Yeah, it's challenging. It can be a shit show. But if there's anything that I mentioned that you needed more information about, you know, it's all covered in the Vertical Diet 3.0 ebook, of course. It's at Efferding.com. But I also have all of this stuff in my phone. I've been accumulating that. That's how the Vertical Diet ebook came to be. I just, every time I came across some information, and I would create a note in my notepad. My notepad's like every topic you can imagine.
Wow.
I have a header, and then everything I come across that I think is really good information that people should, I copy and paste it in there, so I could quickly reference just about anything we discussed today, and I could go down and find all the references to the, you know, the PMIDs, to the all the PubMed articles, and the professionals in the industry that I'm a big fan of what did I say earlier? Referring to the professionals in the industry, appealing to authority. I'm a big fan of doing that. I'm like, well, so-and-so says. And, I get a lot of mileage out of that because they're domain-specific professionals.
Yeah.
If somebody asks me about nutrition, I'm going to send to somebody with a PhD in nutrition. My co-author of The Vertical Diet, who I partnered with about 5 years ago, is a PhD RDN who was director of dietetics at UNLV and an instructor in their exercise phys department. It's one of the most brilliant people I know, Dr. Damon McCune. And that's how I started to really, I think, hone in on having to provide appropriate references. He put in over 200 references to peer-reviewed research.
I love the experts and the PhDs and all that. I just wish, I mean, the vast majority of them are awesome, but then you get this like handful of them whose personalities are so noxious on social media.
Yep.
I mean, it's like all they do is they call out others, and they act as though they themselves have no bias, which everybody has bias.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting, because like I said, I followed these people for years.
Yeah.
They've evolved. Things that I've been picked on, I used to not have such I used to not demonize saturated fats, but I've always recommended a low saturated fat diet. 30% of total calories is fat, and that constitutes of lean sources: top sirloin, 96.4 beef, bison, yogurt, egg white blends, and so it ended up being less than 10% fat. But I didn't demonize saturated fat some years ago. Lane Norton didn't either. As recent as 4 years ago, he posted a video where he said saturated fats were fine. Examine.com, they have 14 PhDs. Kamal Patel, brilliant guy. They posted an article as recently as 12, 18 months ago that fell to the same mistake that a lot of people make, where they were saying that there was no difference in cardiovascular disease risk based on saturated fat because they were in that asymptotic zone of the low end of the S-shaped curve. They since updated it. But Dr. Peter Attia used to promote Gary Taubes' research very heavily. And most of what Gary Taubes has espoused in his book and the references that he used have been since disproven.
Yeah, the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity was kind of his thing, right?
Yes, that would be Dr. Jason Fung. Same thing. It was, eat a grape, your insulin rises, you can't lose fat.
Yeah.
If you're in a calorie deficit, we know that's not true. It doesn't matter how many carbohydrates you consume. In your deficit, you're in a deficit. But
100%.
my point is that who am I? And I can't be held to a higher standard than a PhD who said the same thing as I have said.
Look, I agree. I just think that we mustn't forget that they are still victim. No matter how many credentials a person has after their name, you can still succumb to the Dunning-Kruger effect. You can still be influenced
you can have a bias.
By groupthink. You can still have a bias.
Yeah.
A lot of these people very small minority, but they're on social media, they're chasing clout, and they're fiercely territorial, and they're highly guarded of territorial over their ideas and the whatever perspective it is that they're advancing and trying to make a name for themselves on social media. So
you get a lot more response being disagreeable than agreeable. That's for sure. I mean, Lane's built quite a career on it, and he's good at it. And I think some people think he's obnoxious. I kind of like him as long as I steer clear of being featured on his show. And part of that is maybe an incentive for me. As I mentioned years ago, I saw these academics.
He called me out once. The other thing is that these academics, they're all about nuance, right? But then they're very quick to see a thin slice of something that you've said without doing their due diligence and researching and going into all the other things that you might have said around that, like your McDonald's video diet, right? Yeah. Like, how many people actually took the time to see what you were to see the context of what it is that you were saying, to understand that before jumping on you?
Right.
Very few. And I feel like a lot of the online credentialist community is just as quick to do that, to have that same kind of fallacy,
there are some.
Thinking.
I like the open nature. I kind of like the debates. I wish people would talk to each other more.
I agree.
That would probably be the better solution.
I agree. Because we all agree on We all agree on vastly more than we disagree.
I was about to say that, but I'm a big promoter of red meat. Simon Hill is a vegan. I was on Mark Bell's show, and Simon was on it subsequent, and he says we probably agree on about 95 to 99% of this 100%. Stuff. Yeah, and that is true at the end of the day. And a lot of people, they evolve. But by the time you start getting, the business that you're in, you start inviting people onto your show, you start to see what information is legitimate and what is probably sensational or less meaningful, and that's a process. And that's a process for even some of the names I mentioned today.
Yeah, as long as you're open-minded and you're doing this from a place of integrity, authenticity, compassion, and you're willing to have conversations with people from across the aisle, so to speak, then I think you're a good actor.
What's funny is that we're generally talking to an audience who has embraced fitness. And that's not the vast majority of. We're not talking to the 70% of people who are overweight and obese. The vast majority of these people aren't watching our shows or scrolling through our Instagrams. Life is taking them over. They've, in many cases, just don't have the knowledge or the interest to do anything about it, or maybe they're unable to. That's kind of one of the big conversations that's out there right now. A lot of these people may have either financial, social, these what do they call these food these places where there's just tons of these fast food places and
like food deserts.
Food deserts, or to be just the opposite of that, right? Where you got there's just too much ultra processed, highly palatable, cheap, convenient food. It's not like they don't know. It's just that it's, and a lot of people chalk it up to willpower. Willpower is not an effective strategy. You'll lose that battle every time. We see that with whole foods as compared to ultra processed foods. You can willpower the hell out of that, but you're going to lose the hormones that are going to be released to causing you to eat, the hunger. That's not a good strategy. So I brought this up on Mind Pump and upset one of the hosts when I said that and I talked about this in my obesity rant many years ago. I think the title of it was "What We Can Learn from the Fattest People in the World," and that wasn't an insult. My wife's Samoan, but the Samoan community is amongst the most
obese
in the world. And one of the things that I discussed on there was that it's not that they don't know; it's just that their ability to do anything about it. They're in an environment where the most affordable foods are those things that are shipped there, like seed oils, white flour, and sugar, and they overconsume. It's a tragic situation. And I said that the only way that we're going to make I don't know who we is, but we're all trying in our own little way. Sometimes we talk about the obesity epidemic, and we're not making any impact on that whatsoever. I'm sorry. None of us are. None of us who write diet books, none of us who have podcasts about, the obesity epidemic, we're not making a dent. Okay, semaglutide might make a dent, to be honest with you. But my point about that is that it's going to take some major intervention, kind of like smoking. And what's frustrating about that is that the only people that could intervene would be your politicians, and they fuck everything up. It would turn into a disaster. It wouldn't be successful. It would turn into a great big money grab, and their coffers are already being filled by these food companies that just don't give a shit. They're making billions of dollars. That needs to be fixed, and nobody has the capacity to do that in the absence of governmental intervention, and they screw everything up. So
it's like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
We are.
Oh man, so depressing.
Shouldn't have ended on that note. Things were going so well, and
but I mean,
but if you want to get jacked and you want to,
there you go.
Yeah.
Well, you have the power, dear listener, dear viewer, listening to this, to share this with people in your life that you think may need it and benefit from it. I mean, collectively, we can all have a big impact, right? One of us might not be able to have it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from David Mitchell. I'm but one drop in an endless ocean, yet what is any ocean but a multitude of drops? Together, we can all work together to solve this problem, but it's going to take work. And it's going to take cooperation. And it's going to take having conversations with one another.
The most successful people at making change for their clients are the personal trainers on the front lines. It's not all the people we've been talking about. It's not the guys with the PhDs in nutrition. It's not those people. It's not the MDs. This has been researched. They've studied those people. They don't have very good long-term
Who is the
efficacy.
Personal trainers?
The personal trainers, the people on the front lines, the ones who interact with the client the most.
Yeah, but who can afford a personal trainer? That's a pretty privileged.
You need somebody to help in your corner, whether it's a coach or a spouse or something.
I mean, no shit against personal trainers. I'm like, thankfully, I can afford a personal trainer. I don't use one, but if everybody, if all 300 million people in this country, or I guess the 60% who are overweight or obese could afford a personal trainer, then we'd be in a much different place. But
yeah, well, they have the best success, and my hat's off to them. I think oftentimes they get forgotten. Yeah, but they're the people who are there every single day when the client shows up, or 3 times a week. That actually express some sort of interest. A client doesn't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's what's most important, is that these personal trainers interact with that client as often as possible. Reaches out to them, supports them, tells them to come in. That's what they need.
Yeah.
Sometimes as an online coach, clients will say they need more accountability. It's hard for me to do online. I find that the in-person people are a little better. They keep the clients longer, and they may get better results just because they're there all the time.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.